Hello, and welcome to our Virginia Promise Partnership Promise Insider podcast and digital talk show. I am thrilled to have with us today Chris Wadika with the Commonwealth Institute. And Chris is definitely one of our most active Virginia Promise Partnership members. He serves as co-chair of the policy committee and has just been a huge supporter through the Commonwealth Institute for the Virginia Promise Partnership. So welcome to our show today, Chris.
Thanks, Krista. It's great to be here.
Excellent. So let's start off. Can you just talk about what TCI does and how you all as an organization are involved in the budget process?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I work as a senior policy analyst at the Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analysis, or TCI for short. And we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and advocacy organization here in Richmond, Virginia, and we work to advance racial and economic justice in the Commonwealth. And we do that by advocating for fiscal and public policies, and we are also trying to do that in partnership with impacted communities to inform our work and to help in terms of designing some of those policy proposals. And so how we came to this work is that we are a multi-issue organization. We work across different policy areas, but one of our real core areas of expertise and where we've done work for the longest, I'd say, is around fiscal policy and the state budget. And so we do closely track the budget process from the beginning of the formal introduction of the budget in December by the governor, and then through until it gets signed into law the following year.
Excellent. So why was it so important for TCI to join the Virginia Promise Partnership?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So I think just for the listeners who might not be familiar with us, we haven't typically worked that much in the early childhood space in Virginia. We do a lot of work, as I said, around the state budget and around fiscal policy in general. And so I think we did come to a realization based on, I think, the pandemic really crystallizing things with just how important childcare is and early childhood for this moment we're in. And we saw a lot of the challenges that parents and families were facing. And so even though a lot of these problems existed before the pandemic, they really got exacerbated during this time. And so we just saw it as being really critical in supporting of a lot of the other policies that we had already been working on. And then also I think that because this is a conversation that needs to happen at the state level and is happening now, that we just wanted to be part of it and to offer our skills in terms of looking at budgets and some of the financing. And so that's kind of where we see our role in this larger partnership and working with the other organizations and other folks who are involved.
And Chris, you all have really been a huge help. It's just been such a benefit to have you all at the table. So we really, really appreciate all that you do for racial and economic justice, as well as some of the issues that we're working on. So can you talk more about your budget priorities as an organization?
Yeah, so I focus on tax policy specifically. And so there are a number of big tax policy decisions that still need to be made between the House and Senate. And so the really big one in terms of the dollar amount is the proposal, which is in the House budget, around doubling the state standard deduction. And doing that would reduce revenue in the budget over the 2-year period by about $2.1 billion. And so we are very focused on that and would love to see that get reduced, because we do see the need for investing in other areas. And so that $2.1 billion could be spent in other ways as well. And so that's going to be negotiated to see where they land on that. Another tax item that I'm focused on and that TCI and some of our partners have been working on for many years is around making the state's earned income tax credit, or EITC, fully refundable. And that was included in the Senate budget, but not in the House. And I think that's another policy that would be designed to put money back in the pockets of working families in Virginia, especially families with lower and moderate incomes. And so that's another item being negotiated right now. And then I think a couple of other items just to flag around in the K-12 area. One policy that we've worked on for many years, along with many of our partners, is around increasing funding for something known as the at-risk add-on. And what that does is provides additional funds to school divisions in Virginia based on student poverty numbers. And the Senate includes a pretty large increase in funding for that program. The House provides a smaller increase. There's a difference of about $200 million that the Senate is doing that. So we'd like to see the House get closer to that Senate amount. And then on healthcare, I'll just say that we are supportive of a lot of the investments around behavioral health, around increasing some of the reimbursements for different rates for state health programs. And then also a big priority for us and some of our other healthcare partners is around something we'd like to call Cover All Kids, which would provide health coverage for children in Virginia, regardless of immigration status, because many children in that situation can get coverage. And then, as we know, for a lot of children, but also for adults, when they can't get health coverage, then they end up kind of in the emergency setting as kind of meeting their health needs. And so there is not, the legislation around that bill did not move forward, but there is language in the Senate budget to establish a work group to study that issue. And so hopefully they would have some good time to look at it more closely and develop some recommendations. So we're hoping that that study does move forward and as part of the budget.
Those are all such important issues. So thank you for giving us that overview. And I think it's just a reminder to how, if we're going to get our society to where we want to go, there's a lot of different components that we have to work on to get there. So it's great to know that you all are working on those important issues. So can you talk a little, Chris, on just when looking at this year's budget process and what's happened, particularly around the issues that we care about, from your experience, can you talk about how it's been the same, but also different in some ways than previous years?
Yeah, I feel like this year is a little bit different from the last few years. I think the last couple of years in particular were a little bit different because of the pandemic and there was a lot of uncertainty. I think there is maybe still uncertainty, but it's different now. I think it does remind me a fair amount of 2018, which was when the House and Senate were debating whether to expand Medicaid in Virginia, which did end up happening. And because expanding Medicaid did result in a lot of budget savings for the state, it did mean that the House, which included that in their budget, had a lot more funding available to spend on other things, where the Senate did not have that during the early part of that negotiation. And so we kind of see something similar this year with some of the tax policy disagreements, where the House, because they do have much larger tax cuts included in their budget, they have less funding available for investing in other things. And so I think that's what kind of reminds me of this year. And then I think also during that year, they weren't able to reach the final agreement within the allotted regular session. And so they ended up going to special session, and we have a special session this year as well. So I think that's kind of like where I see the parallels between this year and a recent year and the last few years.
That's really helpful. I always think it's great to look at, some of our similarities and how we can learn from processes in the past and how we can make sure to continue to move our issue forward. For those who aren't as familiar, can you talk a moment just about just a general overview of the Virginia budget process and then what we can expect possibly in April and May when the legislators come back?
Yeah, so the budget process, as you said, Chris, is complicated. It's a long process. So it began last year when the state agencies submit their different requests to the governor, and that was Governor Northam at the time. And Governor Northam's administration takes all that information in, and then they produce their budget, which got introduced in December. And then because this last year was an election year, Governor Youngkin came into office, and so then he kind of picks up from where Governor Northam left off in terms of the executive side of things. And then our legislative session here in Virginia begins in January. And so then the General Assembly comes in and they work to produce their budget. And so the House and Senate each have their own process. There's an opportunity for members to submit different budget amendment requests. And so the House Appropriations Committee, the Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee, they take in all that information and then they produce their own respective budgets. And that happened in February. And then what typically happens is that the House and Senate budgets will not exactly match up. And so they will enter into what's known as the conference process. And that's where we are right now. And so a group of House members and a group of senators are meeting to negotiate and iron out all those differences. And usually that would happen during the regular session, but because of this year, they still had some outstanding disagreements. And so they're still working. And that's where we are right now, where they still have to produce that conference budget to be voted on. And then after that, it would get sent to the governor. And then the governor could sign it or make some proposed amendments. And then those are subject to General Assembly vote. And so the members would come back and vote to approve or reject those amendments.
Well, thank you so much for that background. And, obviously there are some early childhood, early learning, childcare provisions that are in the budget. Could you give us a brief overview of those?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So a few that I know that we and many of the partnership organizations are looking at include one is around something called mixed delivery grants. And so there was an increase in that included in the Senate budget. And that's a program that allows families to exercise their choices in terms of if there's a certain program or setting that would be more appropriate for what their family is looking for, then they're able to participate in that. And so that would provide additional funds for that for 3 and 4 year olds, as well as a pilot for younger children. Another thing that was included in the House budget was language around the, I can pull up the exact name of it, around the child care subsidy program and the eligibility there, which is temporarily expanded, I believe, through May of this year. And so this would extend that expansion through 2024 through June of 2024, which is when the budget would extend through. And so that would allow more families to participate in that and get some support for childcare, which we know is so important. And then on the Virginia Preschool Initiative, or VPI, there was additional funding provided in the Senate budget, which would allow that program to serve additional 3-year-old children. And so right now it is primarily around 4-year-olds. And so we know that there are needs even before children are 4 years old. And so that would extend that program to younger children. And then a couple other things. One was around increased childcare capacity in Southwest Virginia and using some federal funding that came through the American Rescue Plan Act and allocating some funds there. And then finally, the 21st Century Community Learning Centers program, which supports out-of-school time programming, and that was included in the Senate budget. And so I think those are the items. I think for several of those, that it's a Senate budget that includes additional money, but for the child care subsidy program, the House does have that. And so I think we'd like to see kind of the best of whatever chamber had the best version kind of make its way through to the final budget.
Absolutely. And thank you for providing that overview. And, just for everyone who's listening, those are really important provisions for a lot of reasons. So one of the things that Chris had talked about earlier was just how the pandemic was especially hard for this sector, but a lot of these problems existed beforehand. So when we do things like expand the child care subsidy, that was something that was granted during the pandemic, but it's something that as we leave this pandemic and COVID, we still want it to stay. So that's a good example of that. And just such great, important programs that as we reach towards our bold goal of quality, affordable childcare for all Virginia families by 2030, it's going to be critical. Every year is going to be critical that we start to make these advancements in early childhood education policies. So thank you so much, Chris, for that overview. And for our last question, this is what we like to ask our guests. So as you know, our goal is quality, affordable childcare for all Virginia families by 2030. And I want you to imagine from your perspective that it is the year 2030, and we have indeed achieved quality, affordable childcare for all Virginia families. What would that look like to you with your experience and your perspective? And how do you think we would have gotten there?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I feel like with a lot of other policies in Virginia, things do tend to move incrementally and at different stages. And so I feel like in the healthcare context, we've seen some coverage gains that have kind of moved in that way around things like dental or behavioral health. And so I can imagine something similar happening in the early childhood space. And we just spoke about some of the existing programs. And so I imagine we could continue making gains on those. And so that's what I hope happens. And so that all these things kind of end up fitting together and create different options for families. And so we have the existing VPI preschool program. And I know there will be additional funds coming through for that, most likely in the future, based on some other provisions that are already in law. There's the mixed delivery program that we talked about. And I think there's a lot of interest from those of us who are in the partnership to continue expanding that program. And there's that pilot that we talked about for younger children. And then I think for the subsidy program that we talked about, the childcare subsidy, seeing continued expansions there and extending some of those things into the future. There may be some federal action at some point, and so there might be some federal funds that come into the mix. And so I think it's kind of an all of the above type situation where I think if we succeed, and I know we're all working really hard for that, so that we'll get to 2030, and then we'll have a number of different things that have been either really strengthened and improved since from where they are now, and there might be some new things. We might change certain things depending on what's working or what maybe can be improved. And so that's kind of how I view it. And it just we have a lot of things out there now, and we just can try to grow them and improve them as we can, and as their funding is available, and as lawmakers are really interested in moving forward on some of those items.
And I absolutely agree. I think that is definitely, and you said the magic word to me, which is incremental. I think anyone who's working in the policy space has to learn. I mean, sometimes you get some really surprise wins, or you get, all the funding you want at once or whatever, but that incrementalism, especially how our system is made, that's how most likely we will get there. So, Chris, it has been an absolute pleasure talking with you today. We really appreciate you spending a few minutes just to talk about TCI's priorities, as well as provide some insight into how we can achieve our bold goals. So thank you for joining us today.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. Thanks for having us.